The wind was a blade against her skin, honed on the frozen peaks of the mountains and driven with cruel intent across the plains. It found every tear in her thin doeskin dress, every gap in the worn threads of her moccasins, and it bit with the fury of a starving wolf. Nita huddled in the shallow lee of a rock outcropping, a space that offered no real shelter, only the illusion of it. The snow, once a soft, white blanket across the land, had become her enemy, a suffocating shroud that leached the last vestiges of warmth from her body. Her breath plumed in the air, a fleeting ghost of the life that was rapidly fading within her. She had been running for 2 days, driven from her people by a verdict as cold and unyielding as the winter itself. A broken promise, a false accusation, and she was cast out, a lamb sent into the jaws of the blizzard. Her world had shrunk to this single, agonizing point. The burning cold in her fingers, the dull ache in her bones, the tremor that was no longer a shiver but the final, stuttering rhythm of a life about to end. The sun was a pale, indifferent coin in the gray sky, offering light but no heat, a distant witness to her solitary demise. The landscape around her was a masterpiece of desolation, all sharp edges and unforgiving whites, a world bled of color and life. It was a mirror to her own heart, a place where hope had frozen and shattered. She closed her eyes, not in sleep, but in surrender. The tremors subsided, replaced by a strange and hollow peace. She thought of her mother's stories of the spirit world, a place where the winter winds could not reach. Perhaps it was time to walk that path. The world was already fading, the howl of the wind becoming a distant lullaby, when a new sound cut through the storm, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of a horse's hooves in deep snow. Have you ever wondered what a single act of kindness is truly worth? In a world of ledgers and bargains, we try to measure everything, to weigh our deeds on a scale of profit and loss. We ask, what will I get in return? But some actions defy such cold arithmetic. They are not transactions. They are declarations. They are a flicker of light in an endless dark, a whispered promise that even in the most desolate of landscapes, humanity can still be found. This is a story about such an act. It is the story of a man who had walled off his heart with the stones of grief, and a woman who was left to die in the snow. It is the story of a simple wool blanket, a thing of no great value, that became a bride price, a declaration of war, and the foundation of a love so profound it could thaw a frozen frontier. What happens when a gesture of pure, unthinking compassion sets in motion a chain of events that will change everything? When it forces a man to confront the ghosts he has long since buried and a woman to find a strength she never knew she possessed. We begin with Sheriff Silas Kane, a man who believed his life was already over. He rode through the blizzard not out of duty, but out of a restless penance, seeking the bite of the cold to distract him from the coldness within. His past was a frozen river inside him, a place of memory so painful he dared not venture near its banks. He had lost a wife, a child, to a fever that swept through this land like a prairie fire, and in their absence, he had become a man made of silence and sorrow. The town of Redemption knew him as a fair but distant lawman, a man whose gaze seemed to look through you, at some distant tragedy only he could see. On this day, his patrol was a pilgrimage to nowhere, an aimless journey through the storm's heart. Then he saw it, a smudge of color against the white, a shape huddled by a rock that his lawman's eye told him was not animal, but human. Silas dismounted, his movements stiff from the cold and the deeper chill of his soul. The wind tore at his greatcoat, but he barely felt it. He approached the still form, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt, a habit born of a life where threats often wore the guise of helplessness. But as he drew closer, he saw it was a woman, an Apache girl no older than 20. Her face was ashen, her lips a faint, tragic blue. She was so still he thought for a moment he was too late, another soul claimed by the brutal indifference of the territory. He knelt, his gloved fingers searching for a pulse at her neck. It was there, a flutter as faint and fragile as a trapped moth. She was alive, but only just. He looked at her thin dress, her frozen feet. He knew she had minutes, not hours. Without a second thought, his mind working with the stark clarity that comes in moments of life and death. He unstrapped the thick wool blanket from the back of his saddle. It was his last comfort, the one he used on nights when the jailhouse stove couldn't fight back the cold. But the thought of keeping it for himself was an obscenity. He wrapped it around her, his movements gentle but efficient. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, her body a frail bundle in his arms. The contact, the sudden weight of another human being depending on him, sent an unfamiliar jolt through his system. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, holding her close to his chest, trying to impart some of his own body heat. As he spurred his horse toward the distant light of his cabin, he didn't know that this simple act of wrapping a freezing woman in a blanket was, in the eyes of her people, a binding and sacred rite. He didn't know that the next day, a delegation from her tribe would arrive not with weapons, but with a solemn declaration. By this gesture, he had claimed her as his wife. He was simply a man trying to save a life, unaware he had just irrevocably altered his own. The arrival of the Apache warriors was as quiet and sudden as the fall of an owl's feather. One moment Silas was tending the fire, glancing at the woman who lay unconscious in his own bed, wrapped in a cocoon of blankets. The next, they were there, 3 men standing in the snow before his cabin, their faces impassive, their presence filling the small clearing with an unspoken weight. They carried no rifles, only lances, a sign of parley, not war. Silas's heart, a slow and heavy drum, picked up its tempo. He had lived on the edge of this territory long enough to know the intricate and often deadly dance of relations between the town and the tribes. He stepped outside, his coat unbuttoned, his hands open and away from his gun belt to show he meant no harm. The eldest of the 3, a man with a face like a weathered map of the land itself, stepped forward. He did not speak English, but the younger man beside him did, his words clipped and formal. "You are the man they call sheriff?" he asked. Silas nodded. "I am." The translator gestured to the cabin. "The woman, Nita. She is of the Chiricahua, the daughter of our chief." Silas felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This was far more complicated than a simple rescue. "She was freezing," Silas said, his voice flat. "I brought her here, to save her." The old chief spoke, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. The translator listened, then turned back to Silas. "Our chief, her father, understands. He says you have done a thing of honor. You found her cast out, alone in the storm. You covered her with your own blanket. You took her into your home." There was a long, significant pause. Silas felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff he hadn't seen. "In the eyes of our people," the translator continued, his gaze unwavering, "when a man does this for an unmarried woman with no family to protect her, it is a proposal. It is a vow. You have declared she is yours to shelter, yours to protect. You have married her." Silas stared, the words failing to form a coherent thought in his mind. Married? To a woman whose name he didn't know? A woman who lay near death in his bed? It was madness. That's not my custom," he finally managed, the words sounding weak and foolish even to his own ears. The chief spoke again, more forcefully this time. The translator's voice took on a harder edge. "It is our custom. You have taken her honor under your protection. To send her back now would be to say she is worthless, to shame her and our tribe. It would be an act of war. She is your wife. You will care for her. This is the way." The days that followed were steeped in a silence as thick and profound as the winter snows outside. The Apache warriors had departed as quietly as they had come, leaving Silas with a wife he had not chosen and a future that was no longer his own. Nita slowly returned to the world of the living, the fever breaking, the color returning to her cheeks. She would watch him from the bed, her dark eyes following his every move with a mixture of fear, confusion, and a quiet, unnerving intensity. They were 2 strangers trapped in the intimate space of his small cabin, separated by a gulf of language and culture that seemed as wide and impassable as the Grand Canyon. Silas, a man who had perfected the art of solitude, found his sanctuary invaded. He was clumsy in his role as caretaker, his large hands, more accustomed to holding a rifle or a branding iron, fumbling with spoons of broth and cool cloths for her forehead. He spoke to her in short, simple English sentences. "You need to eat. More water. Are you warm enough?" She would only nod or shake her head, her gaze never leaving his face, as if trying to read the truth of him not in his words, but in the lines of sorrow etched around his eyes. He learned her name was Nita from the Warriors, but he had not yet spoken it to her. It felt too personal, a bridge he was not yet ready to cross. Her presence was a constant, low-level hum of disruption to the frozen quiet of his life. He would find himself pausing in his chores, his hand on an axe handle or a saddle strap, listening to the soft sound of her breathing from the other room. It was the first time in 5 years that another heartbeat had echoed in his home, and the sound was both a comfort and a torment, a reminder of all he had lost. Nita, in turn, began to emerge from her shell of sickness and fear. She would sit up, her movements still weak, and mend the tear in her doeskin dress with a needle and thread Silas had left on the table. She began to take in her surroundings. The Spartan cleanliness of the cabin, the neatly stacked firewood, the worn Bible on the mantelpiece, the single, faded photograph of a woman and a small child that he never looked at but never put away. She saw not a brute or a captor, but a man drowning in a private sea of grief. She started to help in small ways. She would fold the blankets on the bed after he had risen, her hands moving with an innate grace. One day, he returned from checking his traps to find she had taken the meager vegetables he had and made a savory, fragrant stew, a taste far richer than anything his own clumsy cooking had ever produced. They ate that meal in their usual silence, but something had shifted. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the quiet of two people beginning to share a space, a life. He looked at her across the small table, and for the first time, he saw not the Apache woman, not the symbol of his unwanted marriage, but a person, resilient and strong. He cleared his throat. "The stew is good," he said. She looked up, and for the first time, a small, tentative smile touched her lips. It was a fragile thing, but it was enough. The thaw came not to the land, but to the small, insulated world within the cabin walls. It was a slow, almost imperceptible process, like the melting of a glacier, driven by the quiet warmth of shared existence. Silas found himself talking more, not in long conversations, but in small offerings of words. He would name objects as he used them. "This is a lantern," he'd say, lighting the wick as dusk fell. "Firewood. X." He was teaching her his language, and in doing so he was opening the door to his world, just a crack. Nita was a quick study, her mind sharp and observant. She would repeat the words softly, her pronunciation hesitant at first, then growing in confidence. She, in turn, taught him without speaking. She showed him how to read the subtle signs of the forest, the track of a snowshoe hare he had missed, the way a bent twig indicated the path a deer had taken. She showed him which winter roots were edible, which herbs could be made into a soothing tea. She was reintroducing him to the land he lived on, revealing a life and a language in the landscape that he, for all his years as a frontiersman, had never truly seen. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, sealing them in their cocoon of firelight and silence, Nita pointed to the faded photograph on the mantelpiece. "Who?" she asked, the single word soft but clear. Silas froze. It was the one part of his past he kept locked away, a shrine of pain he never approached. He had not spoken their names, Sarah and little Jacob, in 5 years. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken grief. He looked at Nita's face, at her patient, questioning eyes, and saw not curiosity, but a deep, knowing empathy. She understood loss. He could see it in the depths of her gaze. He walked to the mantel, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He picked up the photograph, his thumb gently stroking the glass over his wife's face. "My wife," he said, his voice thick with rust and disuse. "Sarah." He pointed to the small boy. "My son, Jacob." He didn't need to say more. The story was in the tremor in his voice, the hollowness in his eyes. Nita rose and came to stand beside him. She didn't speak, didn't touch him. She simply stood with him in his moment of remembrance, a silent, powerful pillar of support. In that shared moment of grief, the final wall of ice around Silas's heart began to crack. He was no longer just her protector. She was becoming his confidant. Later that week, it was her turn. As she gained strength, the trauma of her exile surfaced. He found her one morning staring out the window, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "What is it?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She told him her story, in a halting mix of her own tongue and the English words he had taught her. She had been promised to a cruel, boastful warrior, a man she did not love. When she refused him, he spread lies, accusing her of bringing bad spirits to the tribe. In their fear of the harsh winter, the elders had cast her out to appease the spirits, a sacrifice to the storm. As he listened, Silas felt a righteous anger burn through him, a protective fire he hadn't felt in years. She was not a criminal. She was a victim, underestimated, virtuous, resilient. He looked at her, no longer a stranger but a woman of immense courage who had survived not just the blizzard, but the cruelty of her own people. "He will not hurt you," Silas declared, the words of vow. "This is your home now. I will not let anyone harm you." She looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw trust, fragile yet fierce. In that moment, the arrangement forced upon them by custom began to feel like something else entirely. Felt like destiny. The town of Redemption was a place built on precarious foundations. Gold dust, cattle drives, and a fragile truce with the vast, untamed wilderness that surrounded it. At the center of its web of power and greed was Jedediah Thorne, a man whose ambition was as wide as the plains and whose conscience was as narrow as a razor's edge. Thorne owned the largest ranch, the saloon, and held the town's bank in his pocket. He saw the land not as a home, but as a commodity, and the Apache people as nothing more than pests to be cleared for the relentless march of his cattle empire. He had been pressuring Sheriff Kane for months to be more aggressive, to push the tribes further into the mountains, to create an unfortunate incident that would justify a full-scale removal. Silas had resisted, his sense of honor a stubborn bulwark against Thorne's avarice. When word of the Apache woman living in the sheriff's cabin trickled into town, carried by a lone trapper who'd seen her fetching water, Thorne saw his opportunity. He saw it not as a story of rescue, but as an act of treason, a weakness he could exploit. He rode to Silas's cabin one morning, flanked by two of his hired guns, his expensive suit and polished boots a stark, arrogant contrast to the rustic landscape. Silas met him on the porch, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. Nita stayed inside, but she watched from the window, her hand resting on the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. "Kane?" Thorne began, forgoing any pretense of pleasantry. "The whole town is buzzing. They say you've taken a savage as a pet." Silas's face remained a mask of stone. "She's a woman, Thorne, and she's under my protection." Thorne let out a short, ugly laugh. "Protection? You're harboring one of them. The very people who stand in the way of progress, in the way of my profits. You're the sheriff. Your job is to protect this town, not consort with its enemies." "She's not my enemy," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "And my job is to uphold the law, not serve your greed." Thorne's eyes narrowed, his face flushing with anger. He was a man unaccustomed to being denied. He gestured dismissively toward the cabin. "That thing in your house is an affront to every decent, God-fearing person in Redemption. She's a symbol, and as long as she's here under your roof, you're a symbol too. A symbol of weakness, a friend to the heathens." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Get rid of her, Kane. Send her back to whatever hole she crawled out of. Or I'll have you removed as sheriff, and I'll deal with her myself. This is not a request." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. Silas didn't flinch. He looked past Thorne, at the vast expanse of snow-covered land, and then his eyes met Nita's through the window. He saw not fear, but a quiet, defiant strength that mirrored his own. "You and your men are not welcome here, Thorn," Silas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Leave. Now." Thorn stared at him for a long moment, his face a mask of thwarted rage. He finally spun on his heel and strode back to his horse. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Cain," he snarled. "You'll regret this." As Thorn and his men rode away, Silas knew this was only the beginning. The fragile piece of his cabin had been shattered. The storm he had sheltered Nita from was nothing compared to the one that was about to break over them. Jedediah Thorn was a man who wielded whispers as effectively as he wielded wealth. He returned to redemption and began to poison the well of public opinion. In the saloon he owned, over glasses of whiskey he provided, his men spread stories. The sheriff had gone mad with grief, they said. He'd turned his back on his own kind. He was a squaw man, living in sin with a savage, plotting with the Apache to drive the good folk of redemption from their land. Fear was a dry tinder in the hearts of the townspeople, and Thorn fanned the flames with practiced skill. Old anxieties about raids and ambushes were rekindled. Neighbors who had once nodded respectfully to Silas now looked away, their faces clouded with suspicion and distrust. When Silas rode into town for supplies, he was met with a wall of cold silence. The storekeeper who had known him for years served him with curt, reluctant efficiency. Children who once waved at him now hid behind their mother's skirts. He was an outcast in his own town. The pressure mounted. Thorn called a town meeting a public forum for his private agenda. He stood before the assembled crowd, a portrait of righteous civic concern, and called for a vote to remove Sheriff Cain from his post. "He can no longer be trusted to protect our interests," Thorn declared, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "His loyalties are divided. For the safety of our wives and our children, we need a man in charge who stands with us, not with them." But Thorn had underestimated the quiet seeds of respect Silas had sown over the years. A few brave souls spoke up. The blacksmith, a man whose child Silas had once rescued from a runaway wagon. The doctor, who knew the truth of the sheriff's quiet integrity. The vote was close, but it failed. Silas kept his badge, but the town was fractured, a community split by fear and suspicion. Thorn, enraged by this public failure, decided to abandon subtlety. If he couldn't remove Silas with politics, he would do it with force. One night, as a new moon hid the landscape in shadow, two of Thorn's men rode toward the cabin. They weren't there to kill, not yet. They were there to send a message. They set fire to his barn, the dry timber catching with a terrifying whoosh. The night sky erupted in a chaotic blossom of orange and red. It was Nita who saw it first. She woke to the unnatural light, and her sharp cry roused Silas from a deep sleep. He grabbed his rifle and burst from the cabin to see the structure, which housed his horse and a winter's worth of hay, consumed by flames. The message was clear: your sanctuary is not safe. While Silas worked frantically to save his horse, pulling the panicked animal from the burning structure, Nita acted with a swiftness and courage that stunned him. She grabbed buckets, filled them from the water barrel, and began a desperate, futile battle against the inferno. She was no longer a passive ward. She was a defender of their home. As the barn collapsed into a roaring pyre of embers and smoke, they stood together, faces grimy with soot, watching the destruction. The physical warmth of the fire was nothing compared to the cold fury in Silas's heart. He looked at Nita, her chest heaving with exertion, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire that matched the flames. She had not cowered. She had not fled. She had stood and fought beside him. "He will come for you next," Silas said, his voice a gravelly whisper. Nita met his gaze, her chin held high. "Let him come," she said, her English clear and strong. "We will be ready." The air in the days that followed was thick with the anticipation of violence. The scent of burnt timber hung over the cabin, a constant, acrid reminder of Thorn's promise. Silas no longer rode into town. Their small homestead had become an island, a fortress against a hostile world. He and Nita worked in a seamless, unspoken partnership, preparing for the inevitable assault. He cleaned and oiled his weapons, the rifle, the Colt, a shotgun he kept for emergencies, with a grim, methodical focus. His movements were those of a soldier returning to a familiar, terrible rhythm. He showed Nita how to load and fire the shotgun, his hands guiding hers, the brief contact a current of shared purpose in the tense air. She learned quickly, her fear sublimated into a cold, determined resolve. She was no longer the damsel in distress. She was a warrior preparing to defend her home, her life, her newfound family of two. Her own preparations were just as crucial. She used her knowledge of the land to set subtle traps and alarms around the cabin's perimeter. Tripwires made of sinew that would rustle branches, carefully arranged stones that would clatter under a careless boot. She barricaded the windows, leaving only small slits for firing, turning their humble home into a defensible pillbox. They were a study in contrasts, the stoic, battle-hardened lawman and the quiet Apache woman. But their purpose was one. In the long, tense evenings, the silence was different again. It was the silence of soldiers before a battle, a shared space where fear and courage commingled. One night, she found him staring at the photograph of his family. "You fight for them," she said. Not a question but a statement. He nodded, unable to speak. "I fight for you," she said simply. "You gave me a home. You gave me honor." The simple, direct honesty of her words cut through the years of his grief and isolation. He turned to her, and in the flickering lamplight, he saw not just a partner in survival, but the woman who had brought his dead heart back to life. "Nita," he said, speaking her name with a reverence he hadn't known he possessed. "I am the one who has been honored." The attack came just before dawn, the gray, liminal hour between night and day. Thorn, impatient and arrogant, rode with 4 of his men, confident that a show of overwhelming force would be enough to crush the lone sheriff. But they were not prepared for what awaited them. The first warning was a shower of pebbles Nita had balanced on a low-hanging branch, a sound that gave Silas the precious seconds he needed. "They're here," he said, his voice calm. The first shot was not from Thorn's men, but from Silas's rifle, a deafening crack that sent one of the attackers tumbling from his saddle. The siege had begun. Thorn and his men took cover, returning fire, the cabin's wooden walls splintering under the onslaught of bullets. Thorn screamed, his voice raw with fury. "Give me the squaw, Kane, and I'll let you live." From inside, Silas's rifle answered, the bullet thudding into the tree trunk Thorn hid behind. The fight was a chaotic symphony of gunfire, splintering wood, and shouted curses. Silas moved with deadly efficiency, firing from one window, then another, creating the illusion of more than one defender. But as one of Thorn's men tried to circle around to the less protected rear of the cabin, he was met by an unexpected blast. Nita stood at the back window, the shotgun braced against her shoulder, smoke curling from its barrels. She had not hesitated. She had seen the threat and eliminated it. The look on Thorn's face, visible for a brief moment, was one of pure shock. This was not the fight he had expected. He had come for a lone, broken-down sheriff and a timid savage. Instead, he had found a fortress defended by 2 unyielding spirits, fighting as one. The battle raged as the sun began to climb, casting long shadows across the blood-spattered snow. Thorn was down to his last man, his arrogance curdling into a desperate, cornered animal ferocity. He knew he could not win a prolonged fight, and he could not retreat in failure. In a final, foolish act of malice, he abandoned cover and made a mad dash for the cabin, a flaming torch in his hand, intending to burn them out, to destroy the home that had become a symbol of his humiliation. "If I can't have the land, no one will," he shrieked, his face a mask of insane rage. Silas raised his rifle, taking aim, but at that moment, Nita's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. "Wait!" She pointed toward the ridge overlooking the cabin. Silhouetted against the morning sky was a line of riders, Apache warriors, her people. They sat on their horses, silent and still as the stones around them, their lances glinting in the new day's light. They had not come to fight. They had come to watch, to bear witness. Thorn froze, the torch in his hand faltering. He was trapped between the sheriff in the cabin and the warriors on the ridge. His world had shrunk to this small, fatal patch of ground. Seeing his hesitation, Silas kicked open the cabin door and stepped out, rifle held ready. He was no longer hiding, no longer defending. He was confronting the evil that had invaded his life. "It's over, Thorn," Silas called out, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "Drop it." Thorn, his eyes wide with madness, looked from Silas to the silent warriors and back again. He was a man with no way out. With a final, guttural scream of defiance, he lunged not at Silas, but toward Nita, who had emerged to stand beside her husband. It was his last mistake. Silas's rifle fired once. The sound was sharp, final. Thorn collapsed in the snow, the torch falling from his grasp and fizzling out with a hiss. The threat was vanquished. The silence that descended was absolute. Silas and Nita stood together on their porch, watching as the lone surviving henchman fled into the trees. Then Silas looked up at the ridge. The old chief, Nita's father, raised his lance in a slow, deliberate salute. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of the man who had honored his daughter, the man who had proven his worth not with words, but with courage. Silas nodded back, a silent understanding passing between them. The warriors turned their horses and melted back into the wilderness as quietly as they had appeared. The crisis was over. The town of Redemption would soon learn of Thorn's treachery, and the shadows of suspicion would lift. But for Silas and Nita, standing in the morning sun amidst the wreckage of the fight, all that mattered was that they had stood together and they had survived. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers, strong and sure, intertwined with his. They had their happily ever after, not one that was given, but one that was forged in fire and faith. On the small plot of land that was their own, they began to rebuild, their two lives now irrevocably, beautifully one. The years that followed were like the slow, steady current of a deep river, carving a new and beautiful landscape out of the harsh terrain of their pasts. The story of Sheriff Kane and his Apache bride became a local legend, a cautionary tale against greed and a testament to an unlikely love. With Thorn gone, a different kind of peace settled over Redemption, one built less on fear and more on a grudging respect. Silas and Nita's homestead became a bridge between two worlds. Her people, seeing the honor with which Silas treated her, began to trade more openly with the town. Nita, with her quiet dignity and wisdom, taught the townspeople about the land they lived on, showing them which plants could heal and which seasons were best for planting. She was no longer the savage, but a respected elder, a woman of two cultures who embodied the best of both. Silas hung up his sheriff's badge, his war finally over. He became a rancher, his hands now dedicated to building and nurturing, not just defending. He and Nita expanded the cabin, adding rooms with their own hands, their shared labor a daily affirmation of their bond. They built a new barn, stronger than the last, a symbol of their resilience. Their love, born in a snowstorm and forged in a siege, deepened into a profound and quiet partnership. It was a love expressed not in grand declarations, but in the simple acts of their shared life. The way he would bring her the first wildflower of spring, the way she would place a hand on his shoulder as he stared out at the horizon, silently sharing the burden of his memories. A year after the fight, Nita gave birth to a son. They named him Jacob, after the child Silas had lost, but they gave him an Apache name as well, Chayton, meaning falcon. The boy grew up with his father's steady honor and his mother's deep connection to the earth. He was a child of two heritages, fluent in two languages, a living symbol of the love that had brought his parents together. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet strength. Watching him play in the fields where there had once been only sorrow, Silas felt the last of the ice around his heart melt away completely. His found family had healed him, had given him a redemption more profound than he could have ever imagined. Their life was not always easy. There were still moments of misunderstanding between the town and the tribe, still whispers of prejudice. But the foundation of respect that Silas and Nita had built was strong. Their home was a sanctuary, a place of peace in a world that was often anything but. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, the same mountains that had once seemed so cruel and unforgiving. Nita would lean her head against his shoulder, and Silas would wrap his arm around her, holding her close. They had faced the worst of the frontier, the worst of men, and had not only survived, but had created something beautiful and lasting in its place. Theirs was a happily ever after earned with courage, cemented by honor, and sustained by a love that had proven stronger than any storm. And now, my friends, the story comes to a close. We have walked with a man lost in grief and a woman abandoned to the cold. We have seen how a single act of compassion, a simple wool blanket, can rewrite destinies. Their story teaches us that true strength is not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. It shows us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build through loyalty and love. What walls have you built around your own heart? What blizzard are you facing in your own life? Remember Silas and Nita, and know that even in the coldest of winters, the warmth of a single selfless act can be enough to bring the thaw. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. If their story of courage and redemption has touched your heart, please share it with others who may need a message of hope. Like this story, and subscribe for more tales of the human spirit. Let us know in the comments below. What does the word honor mean to you?